Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we're going back to the Overlook with Stephen King's Dr. Sleep. Before we do that, we do want to say that this episode of GenreVision is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon people. Our premium subscribers over at patreon.com/GenreVision are the reason we are able to keep GenreVision going as a show. So if you really love what we do here, please go to patreon.com/GenreVision and become a premium subscriber. It's just $5 a month. You will get access to tons of additional content for all of the GenreVision network of shows. And we actually, I think, are going to have another one of our pre-show banter episodes coming up here soon.
That's right. It's going to be a special pre-show banter, more behind-the-scenes content where we're actually doing it on video for the first time. Both Drew and myself will appear on video as sort of just a little experiment. And again, that is exclusive to our premium subscribers on Patreon. So for $5 a month, you get access to that and about 40-ish hours of other stuff. And that library of stuff is just going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yep. So check that out at patreon.com/GenreVision. We also wanted to mention we got a review for one of our other shows, Finflix, from Cade Inversion. They said 5 stars, great spinoff of GenreVision. Same awesome hosts of GenreVision with good commentary on films, even with films that are not popular or disliked. Yay for us. Being champions of movies that are not popular or disliked. Thank you so much, Cade Inversion. I know you've also left a review in the past for GenreVision, and if you like what we do here with our shows, please go to Apple Podcasts and review the show. If you do, we promise to feature it here on the following episode. We say this a lot, but it really is the best marketing tool we have at this point.
More reviews on the Apple Podcast Store means greater visibility for the show on the store. It actually climbs up the rankings so that people can see it more readily. And it also gets recommended to listeners more readily who are listening to other shows on Apple Podcasts. So please, a review and a rating on the Apple Podcast Store would be an enormous boon to us. Thanks in advance.
Well, before we talk about Dr. Sleep, I do think we should point people to our episode we did on The Shining, which is not just the Kubrick film, but pretty much every version of The Shining in existence that we know of. We covered that pretty extensively, and I'm sure we'll talk about that movie in relation to Dr. Sleep. But having not read the novel that this is based on, I was pleasantly surprised, especially after the marketing really leaned on the connections to the Kubrick film, that Dr. Sleep is really its own beast.
Yeah, and I think that was the intention for the source material as well. I mean, again, intentions of artists are not worth all that much, but when you read that book, its focus on building up this different concept is apparent. Like, it's just going to spend a lot of time building up, this new situation for the adult Dan Torrance to encounter. So the original The Shining was a ghost story. Dr. Sleep is a vampire story. So we're just kind of trading one classic horror monster for another. But in doing so, the structure of everything has to change to incorporate all of the mechanics and mythology from the original novel, and to also carry on those themes was a pretty complex task, I think. Certainly not a simple task, especially seeing how beloved The Shining is, not only as a film, but as a novel. It's certainly one of Stephen King's greatest novels. I love it. I think it's incredibly scary and very well written. But as a film, I think The Shining had a much wider appeal. And the film, to anybody who knows, is quite different from the novel, not so much in terms of overall framework and structure, but motivations of characters and just how their arcs move throughout the story.
Well, and in tone. The tone of Kubrick's film is something that's so particular as to why it has become so regarded. And Dr. Sleep, as a movie, had kind of a gargantuan task in that it had to act as a sequel to Kubrick's film, a film that Stephen King has kind of openly dismissed many a time. And it also had to be its own thing and incorporate the elements that weren't present in Kubrick's film that are in King's novel, Doctor Sleep, and marry those two. And between this and Gerald's Game, which was a novel that was often called, unfilmable, I think Mike Flanagan has proven to be somebody who really understands what's important when considering adaptation and doing newer versions of stories that already exist in some form. Dr. Sleep certainly cannot get away from Kubrick's film, and it doesn't want to. It opens up with a pretty direct recreation moments from Kubrick's film and picks up almost immediately with Danny and Wendy, after the events in The Shining.
Yep. And these are making no attempt to hide the fact that Flanagan had to pick up right where the other film left off, and they weren't going to pull any kind of silly tricks like putting an actor's face on another actor with CGI to match the look. That's just kind of silly tricks and hokery. They knew they had to depend on real performances from actors who might resemble the original actors in some surface ways, but Alex Esso, who plays Wendy Torrance, is picking up, trying to recreate Shelley Duvall's Southern accent a little bit, but none of it is overdone to the point of like making a parody of the original stuff. There are a few moments in the third act that almost reach that like dangerous level of, okay, why are you tinkering with this, or why are you recreating this? But the opening of the film, I think, serves as enough of a mission statement where you think, okay, I think we're in capable hands.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into more of those specifics when we get past the spoiler wall. But before we had seen this, and I had said to you, I think it was maybe while you were in your screening, looking at the length of the movie, which is, roughly 2.5 hours.
A little over.
It's over, yeah. That I'm like, okay, this sounds like it was a director's cut, only to discover that it literally is. Flanagan is the sole credited editor on the movie. He's the sole credited screenwriter. He's the director. This feels very much in tune with a lot of the stuff he's done recently, especially Haunting of Hill House.
Oh, yeah. I mean, structurally, it kind of mirrors Haunting of Hill House in a lot of ways.
Right. So I am nothing short of floored by Flanagan's capabilities as a director, especially playing with material that a lot of people would not risk. For example, Gerald's Game and now this. It's interesting. This is one of those instances where this was both an enormous risk and seemingly a very safe one, because it's like, well, it's based on a big IP that everybody knows and people like, so there's safety there. But as we've said, this is dealing with a movie and a property that is very much holy writ to not only horror fans, but, film fans.
Yeah. If you were to make The Shining 2, I think people would regard it as such a cheapening. It'd be like making Casablanca 2.
Right.
You can make things that are kind of semi-pseudo sequels, but if you're trying to make a direct sequel like Casablanca 2, it's not going to work for The Shining. You can't make The Shining 2, and Dr. Sleep is not The Shining 2. It's a sequel, but it's not trying to capture the same thing.
No, and I mean that in terms of Flanagan's directorial and creative choices, is he's not trying to feel like Kubrick. And I think that's so important. This story not only narratively needs to function as its own thing, but stylistically needs to function as its own thing. And there are moments that we will get to after the spoiler wall where I think Flanagan is doing some stylistic choices that are absolutely wowing.
Yes, and he does make some Kubrick-esque stylistic choices to pay homage, and there is some direct recreation. None of it is aided with deep fake style CGI or anything like that, thankfully. I think that really would have soured the whole affair for me. But the fact that he has to tiptoe around in the crypt of one of the most widely known and widely considered one of the greatest horror movies of all time, it's like he didn't have an easy task on his hands with this, and he really had to walk a tightrope because, you know, you and I watched the trailers for this movie and we're both kind of astounded at how heavily it leaned on the imagery from Kubrick's film. And, you know, that surprised us for a couple reasons. Number one, The Shining is widely beloved, but not by younger generations. This isn't the kind of movie that Gen Z is going to rush out and see. It's going to have an impact on people like us. You and I were both born in the 80s. The Shining came out in 1980. It had that sort of lasting impact in through the 80s and 90s. And then it became a classic film and kind of got shut in the classic film box. It wasn't this IP that kept coming up again and again as a franchise. It was shut away as this sort of sacred film like Casablanca, which also makes an appearance in Dr. Sleep.
Yeah, so I'm very impressed with Flanagan's ability to do his own thing while paying tribute to, you know, the movie that he has to acknowledge. But there's a lot more to love about Dr. Sleep than just that. I think this is a phenomenally casted movie.
It is. I wasn't really confident that Ewan McGregor was going to be a compelling lead for the film, but he absolutely is. And then there's this young actress named Kylie Curran, who's the co-lead for the film, plays a young character named Abra Stone, who, you know, from the book, I wasn't really confident that the character, regardless of casting, would be able to carry it. I think the casting for her was phenomenal. And I think Flanagan has really proven himself very capable of getting good performances out of child actors.
Very much so, yeah. If anybody threatens to steal the show, because this really is a very strong ensemble, it's Rebecca Ferguson as Rose the Hat, who is kind of our lead antagonist, the leader of this band of psychic vampires, because this is part of our unconventional vampire month. You know, these psychic vampires who feed on people who have the Shining, or these, you know, magic abilities, and they mostly feed on children because that's when this ability is at its strongest, at its most pure. And Rebecca Ferguson is doing the kind of villain work in this that I think is kind of miraculous, because I don't think there's moments, at least that I can recall, where she has to resort to being really arch. She's just very good at being kind of suave and intimidating and scary without ever having to, you know, go full Dr. Evil with it.
She's not chewing the scenery unlike Jack Nicholson in The Shining levels, because it's not the same kind of performance that you can see from space. It is a good deal more subtle, but still she is, you know, for lack of a better word, vamping all over this movie in such a pleasant way. She really is so magnetic to watch. And from that very first introductory scene where she stalks and leads a child to her band of traveling psychic vampires, that moment where she grabs the little girl by the wrist. By the way, this is a little girl that appears from Hill House as well. So Mike Flanagan does love to bring back performers from his previous work, especially female performers. For whatever reason, the same women and the same girls keep popping up in his things. So it's nice to see a familiar face, certainly. But that little shot, and you can barely see it, but as Rose grabs that little girl's wrist, there's this drop of blood that runs down. It's like, ugh. You know, it's a really disturbing scene. And then the film only gets more disturbing from there. So it really builds this band of psychic vampires up to be fairly cruel and intimidating, which is difficult because it was a really goofy idea to begin with.
But they're not cartoon villains. Like, we spend a good amount of time with them and see things from their perspective, which is so vital. So they because that opening scene you're talking about, and this is not a spoiler, the way they are presented is absolutely as just pure 101 scary horror villains. And as the movie goes on, we hang out with them. And that is so good.
Yeah, there's a really great way to introduce us to this band of characters. And it's one of the things that makes this film feel like a director's cut is they pick up on something from the novel where we get to meet this young psychic, a young woman named Andy, who in the movie is 15 years old, I believe. And she has an ability to tell people what to do and they'll do it. So she uses this ability to kind of act as like a young vigilante, luring men who are attracted to teenage girls, luring them into the movie theater, telling them to fall asleep and then stealing their stuff. And we reveal that Rebecca Ferguson's character Rose and her co-vampire and seemingly significant other Crow Daddy are watching Andy do her magic in this movie theater. And I was like, this scene is really making me fall in love with these characters and the way that the movie is approaching its narrative. Like it does so in a very literary fashion. It's one of the reasons the movie is so darn long is it just takes its time setting up all the pieces and laying out all these narrative threads. It's not at all concerned with hurrying the fuck up.
No, and we're starting to describe plot stuff, so we'll transition into spoilers in a little bit, but I will say, non-spoilery, that I like that the movie took its time. Like, it really takes its time in kind of that first third, catching up with Danny, seeing what's been going on with him, where he ends up in the story as far as kind of a place where he's comfortable before the real crisis kicks in. I loved that the movie really took its time, because this isn't, and I would kind of say this in general for the movie, this is not a spookablast scare you movie. This is like the best of King's work. It's dark fantasy, it is horror, but it's really about exploring and taking time to understand these characters and their emotional drives and wringing genuine feeling out of what's going on with the drama.
Right. Well, the original Shining novel was primarily a family drama. It focuses so much more on the family dynamic, whereas the Kubrick film, like Stephen King says, the instant you see Jack Nicholson walk into Mr. Ullman's office and start that interview, this guy's fucking crazy, and it's just a matter of time until he goes off. And really, that's the source of tension when you're watching Kubrick's The Shining, is like, this guy's gonna fucking lose it. And sure enough, by 45 minutes into The Shining, like, Nicholson's already full-blown fucking crazy. But the intentions of the novel is to allow us to get settled into this family dynamic and learn the sort of ins and outs of it and watch it deteriorate. And it's sad. It's legitimately tragic the way that King wants to lay these things out. And that continues, I think, throughout the Dr. Sleep novel, but I think is particularly well executed in the film.
Yeah, some other non-spoiler things we can touch on here. I did want to mention the music by the Newton brothers.
Yeah, they've evolved a lot, these two guys, neither of whom is named Newton, but they've been doing his movies and also Hill House since, I think, Oculus. And they've really turned into quite good ambient composers.
Well, my favorite thing in the movie, because every time it would happen, it would take me a second to realize it was part of the soundtrack, is there is a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Like this thump, thump. And it would sound a little different each time. And I would think like, oh, is somebody knocking on the door of the theater? Like, It really caught me off guard every time. And the way it will just sit there throughout a scene to create tension. It makes me, it sounds like an easy tool, but it makes me think of currently the HBO Watchmen show, when you'll just hear a ticking clock and you're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Like immediately I tensed up. It's like this, it might seem like a simple trick, but it's effective. It really worked. And I do like a lot of the ambient music in the movie. And when eventually they get to play with more, familiar musical cues, it worked 100% for me.
I do think the score does a job of keeping the tone of the film in check. Much like Kubrick's film, this movie does have a very consistent tone. It's not a tone that swings wildly from one scene to the next. There's not a whole lot of comic relief in the film. There are a couple moments in the film that are a little funny. I think my audience only chuckled at one thing. So mostly the tone is just very consistent from scene to scene. And the music does a good job, I think, of letting us know what the film's intention is for certain moments and certain images, because there are things, I think, in the movie that could be viewed as goofy or absurd. And that was certainly a problem I think a lot of people had with the novel, and I fully understand that. But when we see Rose and all of her members of the True Knot sort of going through their weird, silly vampire rituals the score and other elements of the film remind us that, this is about perspective, and like, from whose perspective are we seeing this, and why is that important? And I think you can tell at this point that we're pretty pleased with all this. I was really surprised at how well this held together from start to finish.
Me too. And I think we'll start talking about that in more detail now that we can approach and climb over the spoiler wall. So spoilers from here on out.
Yep.
Which, may not be a big things right away, but just talking about specific moments, I want to get back to Flanagan's directorial choices, because there's a lot of weird things he has to do in this movie because he is dealing with characters who have magic powers. And I am so grateful to Flanagan as a writer and as a director in trusting the audience to buy in to the craziness of what he's doing with these magic powers by not having to, stop the movie to have a bunch of exposition as to why this is the way we're seeing something. It does things. For example, one of the absolute banger moments of the movie is Rose the Hat is meditating and is trying to find Abra because she is this incredibly, the most powerful person that they've ever sensed. And, they want her steam. I love that they call it steam.
It's very silly, but the movie is doing all the right things to acknowledge that, yes, this is silly, but it allows you to believe in it for the sake of the movie, holding together for its running time.
Mm-hmm. And this moment where she meditates and is flying across the world to find Abra and enter her, headspace. This is done so gracefully and so beautifully to the point where there's a point I'm like, this looks better than any Superman flying sequence I've ever seen.
It's remarkable. I love the scene. It's my favorite sort of new thing in the movie. It might actually be my favorite sequence in the movie overall. Where Rose is meditating, sitting on top of her Winnebago, which, of course, if you look inside her Winnebago, it's this cavernous, like Morocco type mansion inside. It's really funny. But, as she meditates, her consciousness drifts up into the clouds and she's flying, sort of split, her hands splayed out of her sides through the clouds. And you see this almost like beautiful nighttime satellite photography where you see the glow of the streetlights and things underneath the clouds. And it's like, this is fucking cool. And it goes on for a remarkably long time as Rose is trying to find where Abra Stone lives. And once she finds her, she is sort of standing in the street. Rose is standing in the street in her sort of psychic form. And the camera changes angles to be locked off from behind her. So it's this over the shoulder shot. And then Rose drifts up through the air and the camera following her perfectly to drift up and over the house to where the window is, and she's upside down, and it's almost like she swims in through the window. It's like, this is fucking cool. It really is a fantastic way to visualize just how spooky and ethereal these powers can be. It makes you believe in it.
Yeah, and in that sequence where we're not told immediately, like Rose doesn't tell Crow Daddy or something like, I'm going to meditate to try and find Abra Stone and get into her head palace. So it's like, it's all done visually and it trusts the audience to get it. And it obviously executes it very well because I got it. Like, she walks in and it's Abra's room, which we've seen before, but now there's a galaxy spiral on the ceiling and one wall is just filled with file cabinets, and we see labels on the file cabinets say like mom, dad, dreams, piano, and I'm like, oh, this is her brain. Like this is so good.
And this was such a stupid idea in Dreamcatcher, and yet it's being done in an oddly similar way here, but this film actually builds a context in which it works.
Well, I mean, go listen to our Dreamcatcher episode, but we talked about in that where it's like they got to sit around and be like, oh, your mind palace, your mind library, you still got the lyrics to Blue Bayou, cut to that. And it's like, oh, it feels demeaning to the audience. Like, the audience won't get what this idea is, so we really have to, give them the hard sell on it. This is the softest sell of the idea, and it works.
Yeah, well, and it does things as simple as Rose saying, my mind is a cathedral. And we get shots, just a couple quick shots of the inside of that cathedral as Abra invades her mind. the interplay between the psychics and the exploration of the psychic powers and, you know, coming up with names for things like steam or, you know, mind cathedral. It's definitely some silly world building, but it's all presented in a context that just makes it function way better than I ever thought it could on screen. And you know, when you come from people who take The Shining as seriously as they do and as serious a film they think it is, introducing these sillier concepts, you know, there's a big chance that people just aren't going to like it because it might just cross a line for them.
Yeah, but that I think is earned by Dr. Sleep, because even though we have this, you know, opening where we follow up with Danny and we see that the woman from room 237 is still, you know, reaching out and haunting him, you know, the movie does such a good job of staking its own claim as far as its dramatic concerns and its narrative concerns. Like, I know people are poo-pooing the length of the movie, which I can't, like, it needs to be this long because it has to build that singular nature to the story it's telling. And part of that does involve Danny, you know, Dan Torrance. We have to follow him. And of course there are carryovers, like he's visited by the spirit of Dick Halloran. You know, these ghosts from the Overlook that he's dealing with. He is taught that he can make basically boxes in his mind where he can shut them up in there. All of this feels like a very natural continuation, but I really love where Dan's story goes, where he ends up, you know, in this small New Hampshire town and ends up, you know, kind of taking a little bit of work that he can, working on this like miniature park model of a town square. He ends up going to Alcoholics Anonymous, and through that ends up becoming an orderly at a hospice care facility. And this journey where there's not really much supernatural going on as far as Dan's story. I mean, there is, but it's not really the thrust of his story.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff was so moving to me. And there's two particular moments that I know we both keyed in on. One is when Dan first goes to Alcoholics Anonymous and he meets kind of the guy that runs it, who's a doctor, and he becomes this orderly at this hospice care facility. There's a cat that lives there, and the cat will always visit particular patients and sit on their bed just before they're about to die. And Dan follows the cat in the first time, and the old man that's in there says, like, yeah, that cat just knows, like, this is my time. I'm going to die. Like, and I'm really scared. Like, what if it's just dark, or what if it's nothing? And Dan comforts this man at this moment. And he says, like, I know, you know, that we don't end. Like, all it is sleep, like true restful sleep. And I'm like, it's like getting me right now.
Yeah, no, it made me very misty-eyed in the theater. This is, you know, I've heard people describe this as hokey it's sort of a hokey death drama. Yeah, absolutely. And I can understand people not, you know, jiving with it, but
how black and cynical does your heart have to be? Like, this is, I'm sorry to be that kind of reactionary to it, but this is a moment that it's a universal fear and thing that we have to deal with. Because I had no idea going in why the story was called Dr. Sleep. I didn't know that. And that is pretty much the moniker that this old man gives. And it's a great continuation, because Danny in The Shining, his nickname is Doc, specifically from Dick Halloran calls him that. So, you know, continually through this scene, Danny keeps saying, like, do you want me to get the doctor? You know, and he's like, I'm just, you know, an orderly, you know, here. I'm not a doc. And the guy goes, no, you are. You may just not know it, or something like that. And it's like, yeah, it feels so right narratively for, it's like, this is where you're supposed to be. Like, this is what you're supposed to do.
It's Dan finding value in himself and also in his powers, which for so long he drank to dull, because, you know, he would hear things he didn't want to hear. He would see things he didn't want to see. And it was easier for him to drink to dull whatever he was going through. And so he ends up not quite like his father, but close enough that he feels like he can start to understand why Jack would have been an alcoholic or started drinking that heavily in the first place.
Well, and that's the other moment that we both keyed in on is 8 years after he comes to this town and gets this position. He's been going to Alcoholics Anonymous for 8 years, and he has to get up and do his, chip speech. And he talks about his father and saying, like, the reason I drank was that was the only way I knew him. And that was the way I felt I was able to get close to him and know him was to drink. And this moment where it is, I'm maybe misremembering, but I think the majority of the scene is a single take shot of Ewan McGregor. That's
what it seems like in my mind, but really it's longer shots, I think, of him standing up on stage and doing this. I don't know if there are any reactions from, the guy he's talking to.
I feel like there's one or two cuts from like behind his head, but the important thing is that it feels like it is a sustained shot because he is selling this moment and this emotion, and the camera is doing this very slow dolly up to him, and he says, like this right here, this is for Jack Torrance. And I was like, man, this is working on an emotional level that I think clicks into the criticisms that King had with Kubrick's movie, always saying that it was too chilly and it wasn't the warmer family drama that he felt it was in the book. I'm like, this is that. It's making me buy into that facet of the story, and that's a combination of great writing, great source material, great performance, and Flanagan's direction.
Yes, yeah, it's all working in concert, I think, to produce something that works in a lot of ways despite itself. I think this had so many potential pitfalls going into it, and you and I watched these trailers, and I think you and I both had this air of uncertainty where we're like, well, we're interested in this, but this could go very, very wrong very quickly.
It could go south very fast, and I think we can talk about that a little bit when we get towards the end of the movie. But a couple more spoilery things that I know we want to talk about. We do see the True Knot vampires killing another kid, played by America's sweetheart Jacob Tremblay,
who again worked with Mike Flanagan before and Before I Wake, I think.
Yep. And this one, as opposed to the opening death of the movie that takes place in Florida in 1980, this is violent.
Well, we see this one in well, I wouldn't say graphic detail, but the fact that graphic things are happening just out of the frame, it feels really uncomfortable. This was a very upsetting scene, I thought.
This is going to sound really dark, but I'm really happy that these kind of movies are allowed to showcase this kind of violence towards children in the stories that necessitate them, like It. There's even an earlier scene where Danny, after a one-night stand, is bailing on this woman and realizes that she has a child, and later has a vision of their corpses in his bed.
Yeah.
And when they panned to that dead kid's face, I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, that shot is really bold. It's potentially a little silly because they use a dummy baby and then they animate its face with CGI, and it's just like, that has this like hairline width of like just teetering over into complete silliness. But again, Flanagan is walking that tightrope through the whole movie where I think it works just as it should. It's one of those things that I found impressive. And that scene, with the mom and the child is something that's an important rock bottom moment for him from the novel as well.
Well, and back to the Jacob Tremblay moment, this, Abra is sensing this kid's death, and this is kind of the thing that kicks her off to who these True Knot people are, and she wants to find them and stop them from doing this. There's a really great overhead shot of the True Knots caravan snaking around roads, and the particular frame rate and the sound design where every time they all turn it's like bones cracking.
Yeah, they use like a time-lapse photography kind of look where there's no motion blur or anything like that, but it really does look very serpentine, as they're zigzagging through all these winding roads. Like, it's just creepy. It's a really effective way to keep that mood up and to make these visions something that you feel like you should be afraid of having.
And talking more about Abra, I like that she is the one that is kind of stoking the fire of, I want to go out and I want to stop these people. And the first time she meets Dan face to face, because they've been having these kind of psychic conversations, he says, like, no, you need to stay away from these people, and your ability, your shine, you need to hide it. And this ends up being the arc for Dan in the movie. And Kylie Curran, who plays Abra, is so good in this.
She's great.
Because I love that Abra is kind of cruel as a hero. Like, she genuinely enjoys a couple moments in the movie when they start killing off the vampires, where she says stuff like, you know, you deserve this. You all deserve this. And it's like, that's a villain line. Like,
well, there's this idea that, you know, these psychic powers have kind of darkened and tainted these people. All of them. I mean, like Andy, you know, Snakebite Andy, she's a result of, you know, a lot of trauma in her life. And she has this cruelty about her that we see sort of echoed in Abra. And because only people who shine can be converted into these psychic vampires, we see just how similar these two are. I mean, of course, the villain has to have her monologue where she says to Abra,
we're not so different, you and I.
Exactly. But in this one, it actually does make sense. It's not just some rote, stupid idea that ends up in so many bad screenplays. It's like, no, actually, that tracks really, really true.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
You know, she could have been, you know, a cruel, awful villain.
I love those moments. I love the way the script continues to find new, exciting ways to experiment with the abilities. For example, when Abra is captured and is being transported by Crow Daddy, Danny is able to finally reach out because she's been drugged. So whenever you're, you know, incredibly drugged, your powers aren't, you know, you're not able to utilize them. So Danny basically possesses Abra. And this is another one, like Kylie Curran has to play Abra playing Danny. And it's really good.
Fuck, I feel hungover.
I love it. And there's that moment in which she's able to, Danny as Abra is able to wreck the car. I love when she's like, of course you think you'd live forever. Of course you wouldn't wear your seatbelt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's such a great, like, yeah, fuck you line.
Well, I love the reveal of the dying crow through the hole in the windshield.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yep. Great composition, tells us everything we need to know.
Well, and that's enough. I mean, Abra walks up to him and says, like, I hope this hurts a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, damn, like, it's like, I'm like, yeah, get it, girl. Like, it's cool, but it's also like, that's dark. It earns that.
Well, I mean, think of what she had to feel. Like, she had to feel them torturing and tearing and cutting apart that poor kid. And that scene where Ewan McGregor and America's Sweetheart Cliff Curtis go out to find the dead boy's body is like legitimately disgusting and awful. You know what they're gonna find, and it still is like really awful and heartbreaking when they, you know, when you see that kid's face come up through the dirt. It's like, oh no. I love the story that Cliff Curtis tells about, you know, shooting a deer and tracking it and smelling, you know, and losing it and finding it days later and the smell and everything. But I have to just a small quick tangent. I had zero idea that Cliff Curtis was in this movie. I'd forgotten.
I didn't know at all, like, if I ever did. So when he popped up, I was like, oh, Cliff Curtis. Like, I was so happy. and I was like, oh, he's in this. Like, he's a very substantial player.
His role would have been cut back a lot if this was not a director's cut. Holy shit. The deer story and things like that. It's like, that would have just wound up on the cutting room floor so quickly.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you're trying to make this a 2-hour movie, that there's so much that I think is vital to the story that would get the axe,
or at least vital to the tone. Like, the tone of this movie is so literary, which is not something even the novel could do, I think. It really does manage to feel like this is, you know, sort of like Hill House, you know, a novel come to life on the screen. And that sounds boring. You know, novels aren't really supposed to translate to the screen like that. But somehow this works. Like, even though, you know, they do a lot of slow cross-cutting, like there are scenes that are happening simultaneously across, you know, many, many states and many thousands of miles. But, you know, they're not using clever scene transitions to move you seamlessly and snappily back and forth between scenes. It's like, no, a scene is allowed to play out and end, and then they'll do a cross dissolve into the other scene. It's like, it's really taking its time and laying these things out as if it were a book.
Well, speaking of getting the axe, I think we do have to step into
That murdered me. That was so good. It was such a sharp segue.
Well, yes, I think we have to step into the part that everybody knows is coming, which is the Overlook. The movie has to return there. Obviously, I know in the novel, because in the original novel, the Overlook is destroyed at the end of it.
The Overlook explode at the end of the original novel.
Yes. So this was, like I said, I haven't read the novel, so I was like, okay, this is going to be fascinating to see. It's like, you have to go there. You have to do this. You have to indulge in this connection. And like I said, talking about the music, like when they're doing that drive up shot and that Dies Irae cue comes in, I was like, oh yeah, all right. Like, I'm feeling it.
Well, and the way they recreate the helicopter shot from the Kubrick opening is, they're not recreating it frame for frame. It has a little bit of a different twist on it. It goes on for longer. Instead of cutting away to other different shots in the montage, it's at winter time, it's at night, it's dark, it's snow. Of course it's recreated all in CG, but it's really effective. And it's not just because I recognize this, I've seen before. It's like the movie is using it in some new ways. There's a little bit of a spin on it.
Well, again, it's earned it. Like it's earned this buildup. Like, and I think that's why the movie has to be as long as it is. Because if this was like 2 hours and, by 90 minutes we were at the Overlook, it's like, I don't think that would have felt as good. But I will say that this finale section was my least favorite part of the movie.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the section of the movie where I said it's kind of tiptoeing around in the Shining crypt a bit. It's not wanting to step on any toes, although it comes dangerously close sometimes to...
I think it will for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think this is definitely going to turn a lot of people off because what do you do? And I thought, you and I had this discussion. It's like, do they bring back Jack Nicholson and de-age him? Do they have a body double and they put a CGI face on him? Like, what do they do?
They do what you used to do in movies, which was
you recast the role, which is what they did with Dick Halloran. They put Carl Lumbly in the role, and he's great.
He's really good.
Yeah, he's very, very good. And that scene where he shows up at the nursing home, it's like, when he says, "This is the last time I'm going to see you, this world is but a dream of a dream to me now." It's like, oh, man.
Yeah, no. Well, and that had one of the few laughs when, he's asked him about the Overlook spirits, and Dan says, like, yeah, the last one was, what's his name?
Horace Derwent.
Yeah, and it's like, with his shit-eating grin, I put him in a box. I was like, yeah, I like this. I love these characters.
Yeah.
But yeah, of course, the big, because I was dreading it, was like, is deep fake Jack Nicholson going to show up?
I was so excited, and nervous and anxious to see what happened that I actually, like, all my hair on my arm stood up. I mean, I really had a physical reaction as like they started and, they went into the ballroom and Ewan McGregor sat down at the bar. I thought, uh-oh. And then the fuck stick that was sitting behind me goes, "Where's Lloyd?"
Well,
if you want to hear more about the fuckstick that sat behind me in the movie, you can listen to our pre-show banter on Patreon.
Yes, he got quite the shout out on that. But I'll say this, like that first sequence where Danny's, saying like, "I don't want you to come in until, we're luring Rose here because this place is dangerous for people like us. So I think it'll be dangerous for her too." He says, I want you to stay here. And she's like, "Why? Why are you going in alone?" He's like, "I have to wake it up." And the scenes of him walking through the hotel and the lights coming on, I was like, all right, I'm feeling this.
It's spooky. It's atmospheric. They do a jump scare where one of the lights suddenly goes bang because lights go bang in movies.
Yeah. But
it's all spooky and it works. And it kind of just acts as a walking tour of some really beautiful sets. You realize that at this point the movie is kind of throwing fans a bone.
Yes, I was just gonna say this is the moment where it's like, do you recognize all these very iconic hallways and things like that? It's like, yeah, I do. I was like, okay. And then he gets to the bar and the bartender shows up.
And they don't show the bartender's face, at least not at first.
And he's only credited as the bartender in the credits. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's the same thing, where he's very much like Jack Nicholson's scene in the bathroom with the attendant there saying like, "No, you were the caretaker. You must have me confused for someone else." This same thing happens where it is Jack Torrance as the bartender, but he's he's like, no, I'm not your, dad. You must have me confused for someone else, sir. And, that everything's going to pick up. And I was like, okay, they just cast a guy, like, and that guy's fine.
And I thought, they're not going to show his face. They're not going to show his face. And then they do, and it's fucking Henry Thomas.
Yep.
It's the kid from E.T. playing fucking Jack Nicholson. But he's not doing the Jack Nicholson, characteristic performance you can see from space sort of thing. There are moments where it's like, okay, well, he's holding his face and a little bit of an expression that kind of mimics a little bit, but he doesn't have like the wolfish grin, the crazy eyes. It's like, this is something that is more subtle. It's not recreating a performance to the degree where it's eerie or disrespectful to, what people regard as one of the greatest performances. But, I really just think is one of the biggest performances.
Yeah. And I was pleasantly surprised. This was kind of, again, a big arc moment of he's tempting Dan to drink, and they have this discussion about the history of drink in their family. And again, Ewan McGregor's doing, I think, really great work in these moments, more so than I would have expected. And that's not a knock on him. Like, Ewan McGregor is obviously a great actor, but I was like, this is tough stuff to follow up on, emotionally.
Dan is tempted. We see at the low point at the end of the second act, he is tempted to drink that fucking bottle of scotch. And I really felt like, Dan, don't do it. I really was very satisfied when he smashed that fucking bottle on the floor and said, no.
Yeah. So, credit to all that. But then when the finale at the Overlook has to become, more action oriented, and, the action oriented for this kind of film is very, very, low stakes compared to everything else on the market. But this was the moment where it's like, okay, now we have to have familiar Overlook ghosts popping up, and, to do the thing that we know from the movie, we have to have Dan visit particular rooms and flashback to recreations.
Yeah, we got to have a hedge maze.
Right. Well, and there's, I expected all of that, and some of it is certainly used in interesting ways, like the hedge maze shot.
They do some fun stuff a little bit. There's some acknowledgments of King's novel that didn't wind up in Kubrick's film, and also some acknowledgments of the Mick Garris miniseries, which I thought was fun. Like when you see Rose in the psychic version of the maze, you hear a lion or like a tiger growl from somewhere in the maze, and you're going, oh no, it's the hedge animals.
Yeah, it's the topiary animals.
Yeah, never wound up in the Kubrick film, but are definitely kind of a creepy and iconic part of the book.
Well, my favorite thing in that hedge maze sequence is earlier when we learn about Dan putting the Overlook ghosts in boxes, and we realize that, we're not in Abra's head, that this is Dan's kind of trap for her. And you see this giant box slowly creeping up behind her. Because the first time you see it, it's just like this black monolith shape in the background out of focus. I'm like, what the fuck is that? Like, I was immediately like, what is... And then when I was like, it's one of the boxes. Like, he's going to put her in the box. I was like, this is cool.
Flanagan's great with surreal imagery, man. The way that he builds up surreality, even in mundane things, is like, damn it. It's one of the reasons he's on top right now. He really is a prestigious horror film director, and he's built it up in such a way that his movies are not overtly, I guess, what people would consider artsy. You know what I mean? He's got subtle tastes, but he's really one of the best in the game right now. I can't really think of many other filmmakers who make horror stories for adults that are doing it quite like this.
I think my biggest disappointment with this ending is that, Rose the Hat's a great villain. This showdown is basically going to be like, all right, we're going to turn the Overlook ghosts against her, and they will, absorb her. But then the movie has to end up being kind of The Shining 2 in its final moments.
Yes.
In that the Overlook possesses Danny, and he's going to chase Abra around with an axe doing the limp thing. I'm like, oh, man.
Yeah, my thought was, did we have to?
Well, my thought was like, this was... I didn't mind that it's like, yeah, we have to go back to the Overlook and everything, but I was more encouraged by it using that structure to fulfill its own narrative interests. So that when it was just like, for the next 5 minutes, it's just going to turn into Shining 2. And we have to have very much the same moment that happens in Mick Garris's miniseries where Abra
directly the same moment. I mean, it's even staged the same way.
Exactly. Has to tell him, it's like, when he made one stop, the boiler room. I was like, oh man, like this is not satisfying. Like as soon as Rose got taken out and it became just, the twins have to come over and like, come play with us, Danny. I was like, I was like, yeah, it's not so much the fact that they had to recreate these things. It's that all of a sudden the switch flipped and it's like, and now we have to like check off all the boxes of what you have to do in a Shining sequel.
Right. Again, it felt like a walking tour of old things that people like. And I like those things. And, there is a bit of surface fun, I think, well, more than a bit. There is surface fun to be had in seeing these things again. It's fun seeing Mike Flanagan, a guy as talented as he is, playing with these things, and the fact that it's not trying to use them in any sort of sacrilegious, perceived sacrilegious way is, I feel like they could have just played it a little bit more loose. There's a scene earlier when Rose the Hat walks into the Overlook and she rounds the corner and she sees the elevator and the blood pours out of it. And she just kind of smiles and walks away. It's like,
and that's it.
What? So what? Do something different with it. Like have the blood soak her feet or have it soak her. Like do something different with the scene.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. That was the most egregious. We just have to recreate this thing that everybody knows moment in the movie.
Yeah.
Which like somebody just has to stop, watch the blood elevator happen, and then walk away. It's like it's like
cool.
Oh. Yeah. So, this finale with the Overlook eventually catching on fire. I mean, I like the final shot of, zooming in to Danny and seeing that his mom is there and then he's, his child self again.
Yeah, I thought that was a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's somebody, again, with their black cynical heart can say it's too saccharine, and it's saccharine for sure, but it worked. Like, I was like, the movie did the due diligence to earn this soft of a moment.
Right. It could have just used that image as a cudgel because it's like, yeah, this is something and you recognize, and we're trying to manufacture a sentiment from an old thing. But it's like, no, actually, this movie was an effective family drama before this.
It set itself up for that moment on its own terms in the beginning with, Danny watching cartoons with his mom and, seeing the room 237 woman and coming back out and saying that he's okay and, leaning up against her. Like it earned that on its own.
Yeah. And it's no secret that Abra Stone's mom, by the way, it's Jocelyn, I think her name is Jocelyn Zonahue. She's the lead from House of the Devil.
Oh.
She also looks like Wendy Torrance.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, eventually the Overlook burns down and then we get a nice little coda ending with Abra at her place and she's talking to Dan's spirit. And there's, the passing of the torch kind of moment that Dick had with Dan is now having with Abra. And he states, I told you that you have to hide your power. I was wrong. Shine on, Abra Stone. And it's like, yeah.
This movie's kind of The Last Jedi, isn't it?
Yeah, right?
I mean, there's the whole force phone idea, which kind of plays with the interaction of like what's real and what's happening in the psychic, realm and things like that. And how do they overlap, like Rose's hand injury and stuff like that. Like there are definitely some Last Jedi-ish elements in this.
I was going to say, where's all the complaining about that's not how the shining powers work. There's clear definitive canon about how magic works. It's like,
you're putting the fan voice on again.
Well, it's a complaint that I don't really, I don't see that as valid when you're messing with stuff that is literal magic. Like it can be whatever it wants to be as long as it earns the emotional impact of why it's being utilized. And Dr. Sleep does that so many times to the point that it's kind of miraculous how varied it is with its magic that I never was like, okay, I don't buy this. I bought every single trick, and they even refer to that in the movie as, oh, this is a trick, like a different kind of trick we can try. So by the ending, when Dan basically says goodbye to Abra and tells her to shine on, I was like, yeah, this works. And then we have the Overlook ghost might now be haunting Abra, and she has the similar moment, which I loved again. Mike Flanagan knows how to set you up with his framing, where Abra's talking to her mom, and
you see the shower behind her.
Yeah, it's out of focus in the background. Like I know that's where you're not just putting that in there for BS reasons, Mikey.
Right. And I could see the Calumet baking powder over her other shoulder.
Right.
Thank God there's no Calumet baking powder in the movie.
Well, that you saw. Somebody will find it. But yeah, I mean, by the end of this, I was like, man, this is Dr. Sleep is not a horror movie in the sense that I think a lot of people will consider horror movies. Like it is a horror movie in my book.
Oh, definitely. I mean, did you see the kid murder in the film?
Right. But I think because it is way more kind of, it's such a measured movie. And some people will just say that's just because it's really long. It's like, no, that it utilizes that time to be really careful about how it's doling things out and how it's building things. And that's what so much of Dr. Sleep really invigorated me, is like, this isn't like typical event film stuff where somebody's, leaning over the writer's shoulder and saying, you got to have an action beat every 15, 20 minutes. You got to have something, it's like this movie is allowed to kind of play at its own pace. And I think that really helps it. It's not that it helps it. It really sells the emotional core of the movie, because I was moved a lot through the movie. I was wowed by Flanagan's directorial choices. And at the end of the day, I really think Dr. Sleep is another great example of what I talk about when I say I want A+ horror. Like, this is A+ horror, not only in production scale, or, in the appearance of that. It's A+ horror in tone, in its trust in the audience as adults. Like, it really trusts you in ways that I think a lot of other kind of tentpole movies feel the need to hold your hand a little bit more. I am surprised that the movie turned out not just as good as it is, but it's a really good movie. But at this point, I feel like I shouldn't be surprised, because Mike Flanagan has continued to demonstrate that he is one of the top tier talents working in horror right now. Absolutely.
I never expected that this novel, which is not particularly well reviewed and not particularly well liked by King fans, I never thought this novel would make a movie this good. I think it took a considerable amount of talent and thoughtfulness to get it to how it is as a film. And I credit Flanagan with a lot of that. And I also credit its great cast, Kylie Curran, Rebecca Ferguson, certainly Ewan McGregor, Carl Lumbly, Alex Esso, Jocelyn Donahue, Cliff Curtis, even Henry Thomas in his brief little role. It's like, okay, folks, you're doing things right.
Well, if we want to continue to do things right, let's head on over to the shelf, where we pick some movies that might act as good pairings or substitutes for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to comment on the episode at GenreVision.com with your own shelf picks. Travis, what are you pulling off the shelf for Dr. Sleep?
Well, something I really liked in Dr. Sleep is that they emphasized the relationships between the vampire characters a lot, the true not. And I liked that sort of brief hint at romance between Zahn McClarnon's character, Crow Daddy, and Rebecca Ferguson's character, Rose.
Yeah, we didn't say he is so good in the movie.
He's fucking great. He's another very good villain. He's not operating in the same way that Rebecca Ferguson is, so it's a smaller, more subtle performance, but he's so fucking good. If you want to see another really good dynamic between two vampire lovers in a film, I recommend Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive. This is another film that sort of takes a long, slow, almost hangout-y approach. It's got a great sense of humor. Of course, Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston are lovely in it. And it has a similar sort of approach to decor and decoration, almost like a little bit of a hippy-dippy vibe that Rose the Hat has. It's a good film that I feel like is underseen, and it was definitely one that I wanted to float by you to do as an Unconventional Vampires Month film, but it's definitely not as big as an event, I think, as Life Force or From Dusk Till Dawn or Dr. Sleep. Still, though, highly recommended. Only Lovers Left Alive.
Yeah, I got to get on that. It's definitely one that I've ignored for too long. Well, on my end, I do not have a vampire movie, although my shelf pick last week of Near Dark would have been a great one for this, with, traveling vampires.
Yeah, Snakebite Andy in the movie actually looks a little bit like May from Near Dark.
Yeah, that's a good
Similar
point.
kind of haircut.
Yeah, that might have been either conscious or unconscious homage there. But I wanted to pick another Stephen King movie, and I think a pretty good one that has a similar enough tone to Dr. Sleep that's also about a person kind of reconciling with their childhood past and some trauma that happened to them. And a movie that I don't think we talk about enough is Dolores Claiborne.
Oh, okay.
I feel, and I think I've talked about this on the show in some way or another at one point. I'm going to make this statement. I think Dolores Claiborne's better than The Shawshank Redemption.
Damn, son.
And I think the reason it doesn't get talked about a lot is because it's focusing on female characters as the lead, and not and particularly with Kathy Bates, an older female character.
Right. And it's not really a horror story so much. It might be more of a gothic story than it is a horror story.
Sure. It's kind of, well, it's not Southern, but it has, that kind of, rural gothic feeling.
Sure.
It is essentially a murder mystery, like a lot of great stories. That's kind of the kickoff to the story that then leads to something deeper and bigger. I think there are phenomenal performances in this movie from Kathy Bates, Jennifer Jason Leigh. David Strathairn is a fantastic King villain in this movie.
He's a fantastic actor, period. But yeah, it's good to see him in a villainous role.
Yeah, and it is very disturbing as far as what's revealed throughout the movie with his past. And the entire thing hinges on maybe Dolores Claiborne killed her husband years ago and got away with it, and now maybe she's killed again and gotten away with it. Mm. And she's a very surly, unliked character in the town, and people would believe that she'd kill somebody. It's such a great performance piece and incredibly moving. And I think, again, for us not talking about it as much as we should, I also think it's a subtly wonderfully directed movie. This is directed by Taylor Hackford, and I don't think it's big and flashy, but that's kind of appropriate. I think it's still incredibly well constructed. It's one that, whenever the King Renaissances happen and we start talking about him in pop culture again and more adaptations get made, I don't see this brought up enough. And I hope that if anybody out there listening has never seen it, please track it down. It's so worth your time.
All right, let's take a look at what our listeners picked as their shelf picks for our From Dusk Till Dawn versus Life Force matchup from last week.
We had quite a few, and because it was a double feature, we had some people giving 2 shelf picks. For example, Mr. Milksteak had Near Dark, agreed with me for From Dusk Till Dawn, but for Life Force, their shelf pick was Tobe Hooper's remake of Invaders from Mars, which I need to sit down and really watch again one day. Because I remember it being very colorful and another kind of effects showcase, but I don't remember most of the movie. Loyal listener JT's shelf pick was 4 Rooms, which is the anthology film with sequences directed by, I think, Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez. I can't remember the other directors now. But that's kind of a comedy anthology, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, it's sort of a wacky dark comedy anthology. But yeah, I haven't seen it probably since I was in college. It's been a long time.
And then Stephen Nisbella's shelf pick was John Carpenter's Vampires, a movie I've been wanting to revisit for years.
I've never seen it.
I definitely had it on DVD and watched it and remember it was, like a cool guy vampire hunting, kind of had that Southern fried take on vampire hunters. I do need to revisit it one of these days. Ryan Covey had a couple recommendations. One was a book, Jim Thompson's The Getaway, which has been adapted into movies, but he also, From Dusk Till Dawn, his shelf pick was Grindhouse, Plant Terror. He said, I think also with Death Proof, he's like, with both of them, they kind of get the sense of what Rodriguez and Tarantino were going for with From Dusk Till Dawn. And then his shelf pick for Life Force was actually a movie we discussed doing for Unconventional Vampire Month, and that's Lair of the White Worm.
That's right, with Hugh Grant and, another sort of Bram Stoker adaptation.
And a wonderful movie. That's a Ken Russell movie, and I adore that movie. It's so weird and kinky and silly and fun. Definitely great shelf picks. Thank you so much, everybody. And I'm looking forward to the shelf picks for Dr. Sleep next week. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Well, I reactivated my Shudder subscription. I started watching the Creepshow series that Shudder has produced, and I've seen, I think, 3 or 4 full episodes of the show now, out of the 6, and it's a pretty mixed bag, like most anthology things are. I love the focus on monsters; that's really fun. But I watched the season premiere, which has an adaptation of the story Gray Matter, the Stephen King story. And it was directed by Greg Nicotero, and I think it did a pretty good job. That is one of my favorite segments of the show produced so far. And then the second one, which is about like a weird severed head in a dollhouse, I was kind of like, well, that's an odd concept, and I guess it was executed okay, but it didn't, just didn't light my fire. Then you told me the season finale was pretty good, and then I watched both the stories of the season finale. The first one was what was it? It was something
Skin
starring
Crawlers.
something starring Dana Gould about a bizarre weight loss program.
I think it was co-written by Paul Dini, who people know from all like the Batman and DC animated shows.
And then the second one was based on a Joe Hill story. It was about the lake monster in Lake Champlain.
Yeah, by the silver water of Lake Champlain.
Yeah, and boy, did I hate that one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I
Oh,
thought
no.
it sucked real bad. And I wasn't a big fan of the eel sucking one, too. That was... it had fun monsters, and, of course, the lake monster one had some fun monster stuff in it, but otherwise I thought it was just... it's just a huge disappointment.
Oh, it's a bummer. I really, I
Yeah.
mean, that one, because one criticism I've seen about the show that I can't dismiss is that a lot of the stories aren't kind of in the typical EC mold where they're morality tales where somebody gets a comeuppance. There are episodes of that in the show,
Sure.
but very much so. I mean, the Skin Crawlers one is kind of a really black-hearted take on that, where tons of people die at the end.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's like an apocalypse level sort of event.
Yes, but the silver water of Lake Champlain, that was kind of a more, I think, textbook execution of that EC Comics model.
I've never read a textbook with characters that stupid.
Okay.
Every character seemed like a moron, and I was just like, I know exactly what's going to happen to every single one of these characters by the time this is over. And sure enough, that's exactly what it did. And I was just like, can we do something a little unexpected? I know that's based on a Joe Hill story, and I have a digital copy of that Joe Hill story that I downloaded, I think, from the Apple bookstore, but I didn't finish reading it, so I don't know how accurate it is or is not. Then I watched an episode that I thought was great, and it was the episode with the werewolf story.
Oh, surprise. You liked the werewolf one. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah, big surprise. But also, I mean, that one's pretty well produced, and it actually comes really close in some moments to the distinct style that Romero and King had developed for the film, the original film.
Well, right. It has, kind of the formalist, strange colored scrim, moments where colored lighting and things like that. And it's the most I think it's the most winky at the audience because
Sure.
the werewolf designs are all based on very classic werewolf movies.
Yeah, the story is basically just a very thin excuse to do a whole bunch of classic werewolf film homages, and that's fun. But stylistically, I thought the short was pretty well done, just in terms of
Yeah, Rob Schrab, I think, wrote and directed that. And it's definitely one of the standouts.
And then there's The Finger, which I think is probably the best directed and one of the best written segments of the show I've seen so far.
It's one of the standouts for the season. Absolutely.
It's very good. DJ Qualls plays the lead, and he has a fourth wall breaking role, and he does a great job with it. I mean, it's really acting, probably out acting everybody else I've seen in the series.
Well, the monster in that one is, I mean, they've been pushing it a lot on like their social media and promotional stuff because the monster in that is adorable.
It's so fun.
Yeah. I mean, and the way it's treated in the story is as a friendly kind of pet.
Yeah.
It's great. And it's, again, I mean, they have some, moments where they have to digitally manipulate it for shots, but a lot of time it's just a simple little rod puppet.
Mm-hmm. He's adorable.
It is.
Anyway, so that's Creepshow. Again, like most anthologies, it's a mixed bag, but I do wish, and of course this is just my nostalgia and my love for the original Creepshow speaking, I do wish they had a little bit more fun with the formalist tendencies that Romero really ran with in that original film.
Yeah, they do it a couple times in the series, and some episodes that I know you haven't seen yet. It's hard to replicate, I think, on the budgets that they're working with, but also I said this to you, it's like when you do that in the movie, that's kind of the stylistic argument for the movie. I think as a series, if you keep doing that every episode, people will kind of get tired of it. And not, I mean, I'm not saying me, you do that all the time. I love that
all
stuff.
day, every day. Bring it on.
Yeah, but I can understand them wanting to have that kind of variety of style in the show, as long as, I mean, and I think I said this in my review, where it's like they get the heart of what this kind of anthology storytelling is about.
I think so, but that also means it's in line with a lot of other horror anthologies. And I think they need to kind of nail down a greater sense of specificity.
I won't disagree, but I'll say, like, considering where anthology horror has gone in just the last decade, with not really being this kind of, it's all season long anthologies, or it's all tonally kind of very serious. Like, I think they're carving out a market that's kind of been missing on the greater television horror scale since stuff like Are You Afraid of the Dark and Tales from the Crypt went off the air.
Yeah, they're definitely sort of recapturing a bit of that, and that's fun to watch. Anyway, that is really all I've had the opportunity to currently consume. Let's talk about what you did.
I also rewatched New Nightmare, and I wrote a piece on it for my We Love 90s Horror column at Bloody Disgusting. And the thing, I think I kind of goaded you into revisiting it, because I came out with a strong take, like, I think this is my favorite of the entire Elm Street series. And after revisiting it and writing my piece, I think I really stand by that. I think New Nightmare, it's so interesting because obviously we all talk about Scream, and I say this in my piece that, Scream is the meta horror movie that, to end all meta horror movies, but it's the fun crowd pleaser take on that, whereas New Nightmare is really diving deep into why is horror important.
Yeah, it's definitely a more meditative film, and it's a look at what an artist has created. Really, it is a very introspective film. Wes Craven wrote about something he was going through, and that makes it so much more interesting, I think, than just Freddy's back and being Freddy again. I like Wes Craven's willingness to let the film be pretty different from what people would consider a standard sort of or formulaic nightmare film.
Well, and where Scream, which was not written by Craven, it was written by Williamson, has more of a, parodic approach to let's pick apart tropes of horror movies and things like this. I think Craven's approach in New Nightmare is far more thoughtful, and actually it's like genuinely critical as opposed to Scream, which is, I think, being critical for kind of a fun gag sort of way.
Sure. New Nightmare is one of the ways that I think best course corrected a franchise like ever. In that sure. It wasn't trying to determine a new course for the franchise as a whole. It was trying to comment on the franchise and be its own thing. It really, it's great that it never got a sequel. It didn't need one, shouldn't have had one. It was really supposed to be this kind of extended essay by Craven about his feelings on what he had done and, this monster that he had created. And in many ways, the monster was the franchise. It was something that got away from him and sort of acted independently of him. And, I think he's exploring the horror of that idea.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, yes, there was Freddy versus Jason and remakes, and there'll be something else. But to me, like, New Nightmare is the period on Freddy Krueger, like as an idea, as a concept, as in so much as it's in its original incarnation. Like, It's a comment about franchise filmmaking. It's a comment about creativity and creating something that once you put it out into the world, it gains a life of its own that you have no control over.
Right.
And how scary that can be.
Yeah, what if that is a monster? What if that thing that has a life of its own could kill you?
But I say this in my piece too, is I think it's a film where Craven is arguing for we need horror. Like, horror is the thing that traps the monsters.
It allows us to process it, yeah.
Right, and keeps it at bay in some way. And you know, go read my piece if you want my more extended thoughts on that. But I know it's kind of a divisive film in terms of people who really love the franchise because it's so different. And, you know, looking back, it was incredibly well reviewed.
Oh, yeah.
But I think I say this in my piece too. It's like, it is not a Freddy Krueger movie in the classic franchise mold, including what the first one was delivering. Like, it's doing something very different and so bold that it can't help but alienate some people. But I think that Craven swinging for the fences in that big way made something that is clearly still worth discussing to this day.
Absolutely agree. If you haven't seen New Nightmare, it is on Shudder right now.
Well, let's wrap things up with our
Comment of the Week.
And holy moly, y'all kicked off Unconventional Vampire Month with just a ton of comments.
An embarrassment of riches.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I wish we could highlight everybody's because you all had some great points and some great recollections about watching these movies and how they've aged with you. So this is actually a moment where I kind of have to admit it was really tough to find a comment of the week. I want to highlight everybody's, but if we do have to only pick one, I think the one that kind of educated us the best was from loyal listener Hobb, who told us a little background about Colin Wilson, who was the author of The Space Vampires, which was what Life Force was based on. And I mean, Travis and I knew little to nothing about this person beforehand. And Hobb is clearly very knowledgeable about it, and we thank you. And then him and our good friend Ryan Covey got into a discussion about literary horror. So, you know, this is, as we often get to say, and I'm so, proud we get to say it, it's like, this is why we have the comment section we have. Like, this is what we want, is to foster this kind of discussion and discovery. You guys just keep delivering the goods.
Week after week after week. Thanks again. And I think that wraps it up for this week. What's on the schedule next week? I keep forgetting.
Well, next week we are going to continue Unconventional Vampires Month with Guillermo del Toro's debut film, Cronos.
That's right.
Which I think is a movie I've only seen once, maybe twice.
I've seen it once, and that was ages ago. I own it on Criterion Blu-ray, so I'm excited to revisit it.
Yeah, it should be interesting, and we'll keep Unconventional Vampires Month going. This has been another one of our fun experiments, and I'm excited to continue it with Cronos. So, as always, we want to thank you all so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.